welcome back to the story of Scripture. Last week, we started jumping into the narrative. We started with this first movement of the narrative, creation. In this part of the story, we covered Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and really looked at how God created everything. And the really cool thing is that with each thing he created, he said, it's good. And then he topped off his creation by making man and woman, and he called them very good. They lived in this garden with him. They got to be in his presence, and he gave them some tasks to work the garden and to keep it. He commanded them to fill the earth and subdue it. And listen to this last line in chapter 2 of Genesis, the creation account. It says, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. That's a really beautiful place to leave off that story. But for this session, we're picking up the second movement of Scripture called the fall. So the bulk of this story happens in Genesis chapter 3. And in this part of the story, conflict enters the story in the form of a serpent. Now, it's pretty understood that this serpent represents Satan, the enemy of God. And in this story, Satan approaches the woman, and he begins with just a simple question. He says, did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman considers this question and she says, well, no, actually we can eat of any tree in the garden except for this one. In fact, even if we touch it, we'll die. So she kind of answers the question. And then at this point, Satan shifts his strategy. The serpent says, instead of just asking questions to bring about doubt, he switches to just flat out lies. He says, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. And so the woman here has this conundrum, right? She's starting to question, will we actually die? Was God telling the truth? Does he actually want what's best for us? Are we missing out on something? Is he holding out on us? Does he really love us? And then on top of it all, the fruit looked really good. So the scriptures say that the woman took it and she ate it, and her husband who was with her took some and ate it too. And in an instant, their eyes were open and everything changed. They realized that they were naked and they felt shame. They pieced together some coverings for themselves and then they hide. And then this interesting thing kind of happens. This communion that they had been living in with God and with one another, they feel the shift. God comes looking for them. There's this moment where it says he's walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and he calls out and asks, where are you? And Adam answers. He says, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. And God says, did you eat of the tree? And in this moment when they're confronted with their sin, Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the serpent. Now, the rest of Genesis chapter 3 kind of captures God's response to man and woman's sin. And he addresses each guilty party in turn, and he begins with the serpent. He tells the serpent, you will be cursed and condemned to slither on your belly and be the lowest of all the animals. And then he promises that there will be hostility and opposition between the serpent and the offspring of the woman. And that one day this conflict, this opposition will culminate. And yes, the serpent will bite the offspring's heel, but ultimately the offspring of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And then the Lord moves and addresses Eve. To woman, he promises greater pain in childbearing and lots of difficulty in her relationship with her husband. So the task that he had given them to be fruitful and to multiply becomes a lot more challenging and carries a lot more pain. And then to the man, God says that the once joyful task of working the ground and bringing forth food is going to become toilsome and difficult. It's going to be hard. And then on top of all of that, he says that they will, in fact, one day die. Now, after this, God does something that had never been done before. He kills an animal and uses its hide to make clothing for the man and the woman before sending them out of the garden. He covers them literally through the shedding of blood. Now, this is the story of the fall. That's the end of Genesis chapter 3. And even though this one part of the story is kind of contained in this episode in Genesis 3, its implications are really far-reaching. In fact, if you think about the parts of the curse that God told the woman and the man about, some of these things we're still feeling, right? Work is hard. Often it's more toilsome than joyful. Relationships are hard. Childbearing is hard. We're still feeling some of these implications of the curse. And then, of course, the big one, death. This is something that we can't get away from. Now, if we jump ahead into the New Testament, I want to read this verse from Romans 5, verse 12, where Paul kind of addresses this like inheritance of these parts of the curse. The text says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." And so I think in this passage in Romans 5, there's really two things that are true about us inheriting death and sin from Adam and Eve. The first is that we're sinful by nature. Because Adam and Eve are our predecessors, we have inherited this sinful nature from them. Because they sinned, we are sinful. But it's also true that we're sinful by our actions. The text says that death spread to all men because all sinned. So not only are we inheriting this sinful nature, we're also acting in sinful ways. So we've inherited this. And this death that God speaks of, that Adam and Eve face, that looks a few different ways. This death, first of all, is spiritual. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they really turned from God and submitted to Satan. Remember how they responded after their eyes were opened? They hid, they covered themselves. They were afraid and they were ashamed. They realized that their relationship with God had been broken. So it's a spiritual death. But this death is also relational. When God asked them about their sin, remember how Adam and Eve responded? They blamed one another. They knew that someone had to pay, and really that each of them were unable to. Their relationship, their unity was broken. And then this death is also physical. Eventually, decades after Adam and Eve leave the garden, they do eventually die. But even before that, their relationship with creation shifts. Remember, like childbearing is difficult, working the ground is difficult. It's just not the same. This has been disrupted. This union between them, with them and the Lord, and then also with all of creation. There's a writer named Matthew Emerson, and he says it in, I think, a way that really captures this. Sin affects everything. So this part of the story where man and woman sin, they turn from the Lord and submit to Satan, really puts the rest of the story on a totally different trajectory, one where people know that things aren't as they should be, but are unable to set it right.